Fox News Podcasts presents the Bret Baier Podcast with Fox News Chief Political Anchor Bret Baier.
President Trump marked 6 months in office this week, touting many successes, he said, during this time, calling it one of the most consequential periods of any president. But Democrats remain defiant as the midterms approach next year, responding to Texas lawmakers' recent proposal to redraw congressional maps ahead of the 2026 midterms. Former Texas Senate candidate Beto O'Rourke recently called for ruthless actions in pursuit of power, telling CNN's Jake Tapper this. Meanwhile, oral arguments began in the Harvard v. Trump lawsuit. Harvard is alleging the Trump administration unlawfully froze nearly $3 billion in federal funding to the school. To discuss this and more, we bring in our panel. Fox News senior congressional correspondent Chad Pergram, Fox News senior political analyst Juan Williams, and Republican strategist and executive vice president at Targeted Victory Matt Gorman. All right, Chad, what's it look like on Capitol Hill? What is next on the agenda up there?
Well, the next big thing is whether or not they're going to be able to fund the government in September. The deadline is September 30th, and Russ Vought, the budget director, speaking to the Christian Science Monitor breakfast, said he wanted the appropriations process to be less bipartisan. Well, that's a problem because you have to have 60 votes to avoid a government shutdown, to avoid a filibuster in the Senate. You had Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, kind of throwing Republicans a lifeline back in March and really not getting anything politically from it back in March because they couldn't get over that 60-vote threshold, and a few of the Democrats followed his lead. And how that works out, I mean, John Thune, the majority leader, said he intends to have these appropriations bills be bipartisan because of the reality of the math in the Senate. But right now, a lot of people on Capitol Hill are wondering how they can possibly fund the government in September. And that seems like that's a long way away. We're right up against the deadline right now. The House is going to be done by Thursday, and they're going to be done till early September. The Senate may stick around for a bit or maybe even come back during the middle of August. That's another question to look at, maybe try and knock out some nominations. That's something that President Trump has pushed them to do. But they're up against the deadline right now. Because they've not really processed many of these bills and certainly not gotten the House and Senate on the same page, and that's going to be a crisis in the fall.
Juan, there aren't a lot of Democrats who are speaking up in favor of really anything that's happened in 6 months in the Trump administration. Yet, zero illegal immigrants being released into the country 2 months in a row is a substantial achievement, for any border Democrats. One would think they would pipe up. They have not. What about 6 months in and where Democrats think they are heading into the 2026 midterms?
Well, I think you have to give President Trump credit on two fronts. And one is just what you mentioned, Bret, which is the border. I think especially in political terms, considering the tremendous amount of criticism he had for President Biden's handling of the border, suggesting there was an invasion and all that. Well, now there's zero, as you said, border crossings. And I think most Americans, in fact, in the polls, Fox polls show that's the one area where Americans give President Trump strong approval. He also, I would think, again, from a political perspective, deserves an A+ when it comes to controlling his party and getting good decisions out of the conservative majority on the Supreme Court. It seems to me in both cases, it has allowed him executive orders, the passage of the bill he calls his big, beautiful bill. These are really hallmarks of his first term. I would give him an incomplete, if you will, on the tariffs. We certainly haven't seen any big results, and they're not very popular with Wall Street or with Americans in general. And then when it comes to Ukraine, well, we didn't have a deal on day one. In the Middle East, he really took a great risk in terms of bombing Iran. But, the Middle East war goes on, and a lot of the kind of humanitarian issues remain. So, Gaza is not going to be the next Mediterranean. Canada is not going to be the next 51st state. Greenland and Panama seem to be safe in their current status. So 6 months in, the best that you could say is he's done well at managing the Republican Party, and the opposition party remains, it seems, a bit discombobulated. I don't see that they have a clear message or strong messengers at this point.
Yeah. Matt, I think that the tariff, to Juan's point, the tariff situation is still yet to be resolved. There are potentially other deals, and we've heard of other deals coming for a long time, the EU, India, Vietnam. But more importantly, Wall Street has had some booming market days, record indices, finishes, and it seems like people are baking in whatever the tariff situation is, as inflation maybe ticked up a little bit, but for all the concern, like the sky was falling at the beginning, doesn't seem to have materialized.
No, and to your point, I saw something just today that at the end of April, 70% or so thought there could be a recession, according to some polling and according to confidences, and that's at a record low today. So you're absolutely right. The stock market's going nuts for all intents and purposes. People seem to understand that this is really baked in, and I think you're right. Keep waiting for, I feel like the EU deal is that big one that is kind of the sticking point, and when that gets done, which I've heard there's momentum on it, if that falls, then the rest of them will kind of come in line. There could be, as much as a dozen or so just waiting for that EU one to start. And I think, too, one they haven't talked about it enough is that the tariffs and the revenue from those tariffs are going to go to really pay down and refinance some of the structural debt that Biden took out. And you combine that with, I think, why they're really pressuring and hoping Powell lowers interest rates so they can really restructure and do something help to the long-term fiscal health of the country. But you're right. There's a confidence there that, 3-4 months ago, I think people were very worried, some Republicans, certainly Democrats, and that hasn't panned out. And I think what you see is, kind of to Juan's point, from the Iran strikes to the signing of the big, beautiful bill was probably the best stretch Trump has had in either presidential term. In there you had good SCOTUS rulings, you had good economic news on jobs and gas prices and inflation. So, we're making a switch now. The bill is signed to the midterms, and there's, I'm hearing more about it from Republicans in the White House than I had in the previous 6 months. But we're coming off, I think, the first 6 months with a pretty good head of steam as a party, and certainly the Trump administration too.
Yet, Chad, a lot of oxygen on the Epstein files and the case and where it's going and what happens next.
I was struck
How does it sit on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, exactly. And, don't forget that there is a resolution, what we call a discharge petition, to kind of force the House of Representatives to consider a plan to release the Epstein files. This is something from Ro Khanna, the Democrat from California, and Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, said that the House Republicans are in his term lockstep with the administration about how they would handle this, and indicated that he had no plans for the House of Representatives to consider this before the August recess. It doesn't ripen until August, this kind of maneuver to go over the head of the leadership. And I was also kind of surprised a little bit, but I understand the politics behind it, by Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader, who said he had not looked at, again, his term, at the resolution and said, mainly because it's not going to come up before August, where you have some Democrats really embracing this and saying that the Republicans have something to answer for here. Certainly President Trump does, and think that they, in some quarters, have some traction. And I sense from that with Hakeem Jeffries that maybe they were trying to, maybe he's backing away from that ever so slightly, or dancing around that very gingerly, thinking maybe there's not the traction there that they thought. Or maybe that's not a bread and butter issue. He came out at his press conference today and reiterated that, President Trump ran on prices and lowering the price of bread and eggs and milk and those types of things, and continues to say this is what Democrats are all about, lowering housing costs, insurance costs, gasoline costs, all those things. Some of those things have been semi-accomplished by the administration, frankly. But again, that story still continues not to go away. And Bret, as I always say, beware the Ides of August. It seems like that sometimes when you have a vacuum in the middle of August and there's one other story that's kind of percolating around out there, that story sometimes takes on a life of its own. I've seen it in August historically when Congress is away. And right now, if I were a betting man at the Bellagio or something like that, that might be where I'd place my bet.
Panel, we'll hold it right there. Juan, is there danger in going down that road for Democrats, or do you think it's swing for the fences and whatever works and sticks against the wall, it's okay?
Well, I mean, look, let's keep it in political terms here. What you're looking at is you got some upcoming gubernatorial races in New Jersey, Virginia, then you've got the midterms next year. What's it look like for the Democrats? Well, they could point to the polls. Trump is underwater on everything but the border. And Democrats right now are expected by most of the political prognosticators to take the House. The Republicans have an advantage there, but it's so slight. I think it's like 219, 212 at the moment. But you've got to remember that off year elections, they're pretty consistently bad for the party in power. And maybe that's why you see Trump pushing Texas to gerrymander and trying to get more Republican seats. But right now, you would have to say, if you were betting at the Bellagio with Chad, you'd have to say you think Democrats could take the House. In the Senate, again, the bill, Trump is underwater in terms of his popularity rating. The big, beautiful bill is underwater in terms of its popularity rating. But the Democrats are even farther underwater. So, it's like people don't like a lot of that stuff. In the Senate, though, again, if you think the Democrats can take the majority in the House, you got to think that if you are just going with conventional wisdom, that Republicans can hold on in the Senate. There's some things up in the air. Will Roy Cooper, the former governor of North Carolina, run in North Carolina, replacing Tom Tillis, the Republican? Then there's the big fight in Texas between John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. Who wins that? Paxton being the MAGA candidate there. What about Susan Collins in Maine? Replacement candidates in Ohio and Florida. Can the Democrats make any incursions there? But I think that right now, you'd have to say it just looks like conventional wisdom is House goes to the Democrats and Republicans maintain their majority in the Senate.
Yeah, we'll see. We've got a long way to go. How people feel about their economic situation, what happens around the world, less usually in a midterm election. But, you get an Iran deal negotiation, you get a Russia, Ukraine sitting at the table, Matt, people start feeling differently.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I will say this about the House landscape. I mean, I worked the House campaign committee in the 2014 cycle and 2018. I've seen the best and I've seen the worst of it. It is not where it was back then, where you had 80 seat, 100 seat playing fields. The playing field right now in the House is very, very thin. It's nowhere close to that amount. And so, if you could squeeze 5 more seats out of Texas, that can make a big difference, or other states. And so I'm not really willing to kind of throw in the towel yet in the House by a long shot. So I'll say that. And I agree, like, so much can come between now and then. I think, of course, we're probably underdogs in both Virginia and New Jersey as of today. But, the key has always been for our party in the Trump era, getting those Trump voters who come out for the president in a presidential year out in midterm years. We were great at it before Trump came along, but it's kind of flipped, and Democrats are really good at it now, and Republicans need to get better at it. So we have to really sell the big, beautiful bill and all this other stuff to the base, those Trump 2024 voters, get them out. And I think that is where a lot of the party's efforts will be, is trying to replicate that Trump 2024 coalition in 2026.
Which is the problem, Matt, with the Epstein files, because it splits the MAGA base, and it's become an issue.
What I would say is it's an issue, but absent new information, I think the Trump strategy is to really rope-a-dope this, to not give in on it. And unless there's new information coming in, it's hard to keep this alive, right? You had the Wall Street Journal, which there was, I guess you could call it information and maybe a new story. However, what that ended up doing is it also gave Trump an enemy where he's at his best, right? He wasn't flailing at his own base. He was now fighting the media, which he's very comfortable doing. So I also think it's hard for Democrats to go headlong to the Epstein files when they were in power for 4 years and did nothing about it. So it's a bit of a trap for them as well. And I'm also just, not convinced that this will live on extremely long or have a long half-life, but we'll see.
And finally, Chad, August break, they're going to hit the trail before they do any of this privileged voting on this resolution on Epstein?
Yeah, certainly in the House of Representatives, and that's what Mike Johnson has signaled. But that's where I say nothing can, exist in a vacuum. And to politely disagree a little bit with Matt there, I think that this story has been kept alive without information. That's what's so interesting sometimes about conspiracy theories, that people read things in and codes and everything else. Hakeem Jeffries, in his press conference today, he did point out that, Jeffrey Epstein was detained under the Trump administration some years ago, was arrested under the Trump administration, died under the Trump administration. He said none of this had anything to do with Joe Biden. So Democrats are trying to figure out how to fight this. But I do think, and when you talk to some of the most conservative members of Congress, those who are kind of aligned with this bit of the MAGA base that sees some there with these conspiracies and everything else, they will tell me straight up they are very concerned about the midterms. They've said it, in confidence. They have said it on the record. They've said it in front of a camera. That's something that they fear because they have been able, as a party, to tap into that. This was always kind of viewed as a fringe, group. And maybe as we move into these midterms where we're thinking about the, quote, conventional wisdom that the party of the president usually doesn't do so well, and we frankly don't know what the map looks like when we think about the Texas districts, or maybe how the nomination of Zohran Mamdani affects New York districts that are, swing districts. But you come back to a big unknown like this, and when you have the Republican Party, certain Republican House members saying this is a problem for us, it probably means it's a problem.
All right, guys, thanks so much. Now for a bit of history. On July 21st, 1889, American author Ernest Miller Hemingway was born in Oak Park, Illinois. Prior to writing novels such as For Whom the Bell Tolls and The Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway worked as a reporter for the Kansas City Star, later becoming a volunteer as an ambulance driver in World War I, where he was wounded by mortar fire. Throughout his career, Hemingway published 7 novels, 6 short story collections, and 2 nonfiction works. He died on July 2, 1961, from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. That'll do it for this week on the Bret Baier Podcast. Be sure to tune in, the All-Star Panel Podcast, and Common Ground. And we'll see you next time. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcast Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.